finding a core set of really passionate users where your product isn't, generally, solving all kinds of different problems. They're solving a very specific problem for a unique set of people, and you get product market fit. You do anything you can to get product market fit for those particular set of people, and then you sort of like expand, right? And when it comes to doing things that don't scale, it's more about doing whatever it takes to get that product market fit, right? And sometimes it doesn't make sense to do that at scale because you're still experimenting with what things work.
By the way, it's so amazing that technology has improved so much that with these tiny little dinky little cameras, which have like pretty much no, what's that thing that's in the camera that it's called the thing that sits behind the lens. Losing the word. Sensor. Yes, yeah. That's the word. So the sensor in these tiny little cameras is so small, but despite that, look at the clarity. Like you look like you're using a DSLR camera and then it's able to the AI is able to detect. I love technology, man. I love these little things, these little details of like how little things work. Like, I don't know about you, but
yeah, sometimes it's good to have that attitude because I usually just get.
That was such a pragmatic, like very like a logical sort of like, yeah, it's good.
And frequently just numb to that point of view, but you generally need to have that as well. It's the same feeling that I get with. It's a weird comparison, but it's the same feeling that I sometimes get when I'm looking at my kids, where it's like, this is an actual human being that we somehow created, and but yeah, from day to day, you cannot really think about that every second, right? So
okay. You obviously cannot compare things to people. I totally agree. And of course,
to babies.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think the beauty of, and this is, tell me if I'm wrong, but because I don't have any kids of my own, but I have spent a lot of time with like my nieces, nephews, and like my cousins who are like very little because of a big family. But when you see the world through their eyes as an adult, you realize, oh, wait a second, like they're looking at a lot of things for the first time, especially when they're really small. And you're like, oh, wait, I didn't even notice those things in so many years. Now you're sort of, because they're asking you, what is this, Papa? Or what is this, Uncle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're also sponges, they're even everything that you do, they'll just absorb the good and the bad. So you have to be careful, especially when they get a little bit older, like when they're infants and stuff. That's one thing. Once they're about 5, 6, they start asking a lot of why questions, and then they start, observing your behavior and sort of like trying to see how you are arguing and sort of like use those styles themselves. So sometimes that happens as well. So it's quite interesting.
So out of both your kids, in terms of personality, which one is like, how would you describe their personalities?
My daughter, she's a little bit more open to talking with people that she doesn't know. She's a little bit more like, she makes friends way more easily than my son. My son is a little bit more of an introvert, but the people that he opens up to like really, really nicely. So, and in terms of just the general demeanor, I think, yeah, my daughter is more social in terms of like, she gets her energy from conversations. That doesn't mean that she doesn't want, like, doing other kid things like watching TV and drawing and stuff. my son is super into toys and superheroes and those kind of things. Batman, like he has a Batman costume that he likes wearing every day.
That's so cute. Love it.
Yeah. So yeah, it's even though they're twins and everything, it's just a very clear split in terms of like their general demeanor, preferences, personality, and everything. It's very specific.
Yeah, I think the looking at things for the first time, having that sort of mindset, it's so encouraged in like product and when you're designing things, because a lot of times we come in with experts who have opinions and you're unable to look at things afresh. In fact, I was listening to a podcast with Tim Ferriss and Tony Fadell. Tony Fadell being the founder of, not the founder of, but the person who created the iPod and the iPhone. And he worked very closely with Steve Jobs. And he also created Nest. And then he sold it to Google. And he's talking about, he's like, especially when we're hiring people, if they say that, we want to come in and learn something and we want to, and versus saying that we're subject matter experts, he's like, I don't hire the subject matter experts, because he's like, we want people to come in with this ability to look at things afresh and be able to learn really quickly, because what we're about to create doesn't even exist. So your subject matter expertise is actually not relevant, but a hindrance.
Yeah, I mean, that is, I think both have their places, but the stuff that he would be doing would be more, 0 to 1 efforts, as we say, right? So in those cases, I definitely do agree that it's better to have people who are more curious and people who are more open to, learning, experimenting and stuff like that. Once you reach a certain scale, then it's all about optimizing things. And you would still need curiosity to an extent, because you would still need to do experimentation. You still need to do, even when you're hyperscaling and you're tweaking different kinds of parameters, you need to do certain amounts of testing and experimenting. But the kind of curiosity that you need in terms of just fundamentally looking at a new thing from a new way, that is more suited towards 0 to 1 efforts. Whereas once you scale up, once you've found product market fit, of course, then you sort of like tweak things. That's a different kind of curiosity, I think.
I totally am aligned with what you're saying. In fact, firstly, welcome back to the podcast, man. It's so nice to have you back. I really enjoyed having that conversation with you the last time, and we talked about a lot of interesting topics. And today, I actually want to do a little bit of a deep dive into some of those things and some of your past experiences. And I don't know how much you can talk about your new stealth startup. I would love to sort of dive deeper into that. And then also maybe dive a little bit more deeper into some specific skill sets, from the lens of that a lot of people who are sort of applying to jobs these days have the ability to go remote, because there's this huge push to be remote with a lot of organizations. And you've been at the forefront of that decades. Like a decade ago, you were working remotely, so you've sort of been at the forefront and a pioneer of this whole remote work. So I would love to talk about that more from the lens of a lot of Indian talent when they're applying to companies abroad, they show up sort of in this unpolished way. Some tips and advice for that. Maybe we can do that towards the tail end of our conversation. But I do want to cover some of those aspects just to help out some of the people who might be listening to this, who might be based in India and coming out of school or currently working in product companies and want to look at opportunities outside. So you have vast experience, not only remote, but working for companies, based in Europe and outside of India. And then now coming back to what we were just talking about, I listen to a lot of podcasts, by the way. They say that if you want to become a better writer, you should read more. And so if I want to become better at podcasts, you should listen to podcasts more, just taking my own advice. But I was listening to this podcast where, Reid Hoffman, and Brian Chesky from co-founder of LinkedIn and the co-founder of Airbnb. They're talking about, you have to do things that don't scale. And what they're really saying is that in an early startup, what you're doing is you're applying more as a designer. You're applying empathy. You're being intuitive. You're using heuristics. You're talking to people. And you're doing high touch experiences early that don't scale. But then once that sort of starts working and starts taking effect, then you start thinking of more from operations, scale, and you apply that analytical thinking and start thinking of, okay, how do we scale this? So you start with emotion, and then later on you bring in that logic and science and analytics and all that stuff. And I think that's sort of what you were talking about. And do you want to expand a little bit more on that? Because I guess you definitely have way more experience in that sort of space, working closer on the product side.
Yeah, I mean, initially, especially when it comes to 0 to 1 products, usually the way to go has been about, finding a core set of really passionate users where your product isn't, generally, solving all kinds of different problems. They're solving a very specific problem for a unique set of people. And you get product market fit. You do anything you can to get product market fit for those particular set of people. And then you sort of expand, right? And when it comes to doing things that don't scale, it's more about doing whatever it takes to get that product market fit, right? And sometimes it doesn't make sense to do that at scale because you're still experimenting with what things work. And a lot of times doing things that don't scale also means applying a certain personal touch to really, for example, getting on a call with a customer, and spending, 5 or 6 different hours just talking with different customers, sending thank you notes or personalized letters, all those kind of things, which really delight, the customer in a big way. Early on, you can do that when you're 100 million company or above, there's just so many different things for you to do. You've hired a team to do things. So those are things that you cannot physically do, after a certain scale. But before this, when you're trying to do everything you can to get product market fit, those are things that, you can, do on your own, just making sure that you're not prematurely optimizing things. You do whatever it takes and also have a personal touch, a personal connection with your users. So those are things that, and sometimes it's also called the Wizard of Oz, approach, where, in the Wizard of Oz, you had this whole thing, and it turns out that there's this one guy, controlling all the levers and, just being behind everything. And in many of these good 0 to 1 products, things might appear as magic. Things might appear like, hey, this is really elevated. How did they even program this? And it turns out people are manually doing it, right? In the initial days, right? So that is sometimes fun as well, right? So especially is also quite true when it comes to operations. You just generally have to do whatever it takes, and then later on you can optimize your operations behind the scenes, right? So that is, generally speaking, a good set of advice for people starting out, I think.
Now, I know that last time we talked about your experience as a web evangelist, and then you worked with Opera, and then you also went to eyeo. So when you were sort of working within Opera, at what scale was that company at, and what did that look like on the back end? Because for people listening, how many people does it take to run a browser company?
Oh, that's quite an interesting question. It takes a lot of people, especially nowadays. It's just really, really huge. I mean, the Chromium project in general is something which is massive. To make nowadays, modern browsers are just almost like operating systems in many ways, right? they're really, really complex. They have a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of optimization going on. There's a lot of contributions from external people as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on. When we were at Opera, we were relatively lean, considering other browsers, but we still were quite a lot. I don't remember the exact amount of people that we had across the entire company. It was, well, I think more than 500-600 people or something like this. And that is on the lower end. But our engineering size was relatively lower. But that also meant that our browser engine that we made in Opera at that time, it was called Presto. Over time, it just didn't work out, and we had to abandon Presto and essentially take a look at Chromium and WebKit. So it was one of those things where we simply couldn't, deal with the absolute huge behemoth that was the WebKit operating, or the WebKit rendering engine. Later on became Blink for Chromium. It was something which was, and it still is, sort of like a juggernaut. It is, if you take a look at Chromium, if you take a look at Opera nowadays, if you take a look at Edge, the browser, all of them are using Chromium on the back end, right? So it just goes to show that almost every new browser which is coming up, they're not making a whole new engine from scratch, because it's just really complicated nowadays and really quite expensive to make a team to build your own engine.
So the different browsers that exist, from Chrome, Safari, Opera, Edge to Brave. So there's all these different browsers, and they're all working on sort of the same rails. Is that a correct analogy to sort of?
You can think of it as like different cars sharing the same engine. So,
got it. Okay.
They're basically called rendering engines. So the engine sort of like, or the functionality of code which is used to take HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and mash it together to show what's there on the screen. That is, basically the rendering engine. It renders, the graphics on the screen, right, and whatever into it. So those are things that usually are. Every browser used to have their own rendering engine, but nowadays, most browsers are using Chromium. Apple, the Safari browser is using its own one.
So I think because I'm probably guessing that because Apple has all those deep pockets, so they want to have their own native, and they want to be within their own sort of walled garden, right? I was also looking at, there's another browser, and I don't even know if you've heard of it, but it's called Mighty App.
Mighty, okay, yes, yeah.
So. And the guy who I follow him on Twitter, and I don't follow anybody on Twitter right now, but he was talking about, how instead of doing the processing on your local machine, they're doing all the processing. Sorry, we're going off on a slightly different tangent in terms of browsers, but he's talking about the idea behind Mighty App. And by the way, they're not sponsoring this podcast or anything, but the idea was that you're doing all your processing for all the apps on your local device, on your hardware, on the processor that exists on your laptop or your computer. And the other thing is that typically browsers like Chrome are very lethargic and very heavy, and they occupy a lot of processing power of your local sort of local machine hardware. And so by downloading or using this Mighty App, what you're doing is you're moving all the processing to the cloud, which is basically servers. And what it's doing is it's just giving you an image. I don't know how the technology works, but let's say you're running Figma, a design tool. Instead of having that all run locally, it's going to now run into the cloud. Even other apps, I haven't tried yet, but it's basically saying that moving forward, you won't have to get bigger and better processors for your actual hardware device. You would basically just have a screen, and all the processing is done in the cloud.
That's actually pretty nice description of the whole thing. That was quite similar, and I know that if someone from Mighty is watching, they'll say it's not as simple as this, but in many ways, it's quite similar to Opera Mini back in the day. So Opera Mini was a browser, or is a browser, for mobile phones, where it basically did the same thing. It took web pages and sort of like processed them in the cloud and sent a very, almost like an image-like, display of it to the browser, to the person's phone. So, and this was massively popular and successful back in the day. We're talking about 10 years ago, where at that time the processing power of mobile phones wasn't really that high, and there was a lot of feature phones at that time as well, and they weren't really that powerful. So having the actual web, a way to browse the actual web, where it takes away that heavy lifting and also speeds up the whole page as well, because you're just getting that very optimized image. That was something which appealed to a lot of people. It worked for a lot of people, and that was the first time a lot of people got a taste of the web back in the day as well in Opera Mini. So that was quite good at that time. Overall, like there is something to say about the fact that modern browsers nowadays are just guzzlers of RAM, and takes a lot of so anytime you leave open your browser for a couple of hours, then yeah, you might need to close it down or restart or something like this. And that's where there's a lot of focus even right now when it comes to browser rendering engines, about making sure that you optimize the use of memory and everything in the best way possible, because browsers have become really, really big. So we do all our work now in browsers, right? I mean, back in the day, people use desktop apps way more than they do now, right? Now we do everything in our browsers. So it's become almost like the new OS, you could say, in some ways.
That's such a good point, that a lot of the stuff is actually happening in the browser, from like Google Sheets, like Google Workspaces, even now Microsoft 365, you can access it through your browser, to a lot of management and product management, like Trello, Dropbox. All of these are, you could literally have a Chrome tablet and just run everything through the browser without actually downloading any specific app. I mean, obviously it depends on sort of what field you're in, but even as a designer, let's say you're using Figma, which is browser based, and you could have your entire workflow based purely in the browser without downloading any apps ever.
Yeah. And oftentimes that's way better than an actual app, because sometimes you want to do things on the phone, sometimes you want to switch computers, and you don't want to. You can just open up a new browser tab and just go to work. So it is quite something, right? I mean, the power of the web. So we just want to make sure that we keep it that way. There's a lot of movement going on in terms of like locking down the web. It always has been some kind of thing or the other over the years on making sure that you have native apps more prevalent than the web. And in certain platforms, especially in mobile platforms, they do get more privileges than web apps, but the power of the web is just insane. Yeah, the amount of things that you do nowadays on the web is just quite a lot. So yeah,
so in terms of the browser, now there's so many different browsers out there, and they're all sort of using the same engine. I don't think the Almighty would sort of be put in that same box, right?
It would be, because it's basically Chrome on the cloud in some ways.
So it is leveraging Chrome. So the engine is the same, but how it's choosing to leverage that engine is different.
Yeah, in many ways. So that's still using the same rendering engine, as we say.
Yeah.
So nowadays you just generally have three major ones. You have the Chromium rendering engine, which has V8 JavaScript engine and the Blink rendering engine over there. You have Mozilla Firefox, and it has its own rendering engine. And then you have, Safari and the WebKit rendering engine over there. So these are the three which remain. Every browser nowadays just uses one of those with them.
Right. And I think just because of sort of your past experiences with browsers, and sort of just one other thing that I wanted to just learn a little bit more of, and if maybe you can talk about it, is now that, there's a lot of emphasis in like privacy and, customer data or user data, to be more specific to the sort of digital landscape, and how, Apple is being very cognizant of privacy and what kind of data gets used, and cookies, and how that sort of segues also into the last company that you were working for, Adblock Plus. If you want to talk, I would love to learn a little bit more about, some of this three aspects. One is privacy and how sort of browsers see that, and then how later you eventually started working for a company that blocks ads altogether. And then how does that? And actually, one more thing I would want to know, and if you can talk about it, is that, I wonder if ad companies would look at something like Adblock Plus and be like, we gotta, get this removed, or how do we kill this company, or what kind of what happens on the back end? Like, do you get like pushback on that kind of product because you're killing off so much revenue? Sorry, I just went off on a tangent, but those are like really interesting themes. Maybe we can start off with something simple. It's like how privacy sort of plays into the browser and that aspect, and how do you guys, or how does that sort of industry or browser space look at that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole topic of privacy is a huge topic, especially nowadays, where there have been, quite a few big websites which have sort of misused the permissions that, that they've had with cookies and everything to do some not so great things. So, the power of web apps is huge. Power of native apps is even more huge, and you can misuse them as everything, right? Now, when it comes to ad blockers, there's a bunch of them out there, right? There's Adblock Plus, there's Adblock, there's uBlock Origin, there's AdGuard, and a few others as well. And I've always said this, when I was at eyeo as well, that what people view as what people's views are when it comes to ad blocking or online advertising is sort of like a spectrum. People think it's binary. It's not binary. There's on one end of the spectrum, there's some people who think that no ads should be allowed ever for anything, right? And they're going to block all kinds, every ad, right? On the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, there's people who make their money from advertising, and even creators, online creators and stuff, where they're like, it's morally wrong to block ads, and you're stealing from us and stuff like that. Most people that I've talked to are in between. They're somewhere in between, and usually they're like, if you respect me, if you're not doing shady stuff, then I'm willing to give you a chance. I can take a look at your ads, and if I like them, I might even click on them. But for most of them, I'm not really interested. Let me just block them, right? So that's much more nuanced take on online advertising that people sometimes don't really see, because no one is really talking about that. And one of the things that Adblock Plus or eyeo in general in sort of like has, which sort of agreed with my thinking as well, which was, it's online ads. Most of them are really bad, but if you block all of them, then you're sort of like you really aren't doing damage to people who are making money from ads, right? And there needs to be something which is in between. So that's why the stuff that eyeo is doing is quite interesting, because they have a certain guidelines of good behavior for online ads, and if you pass them, then you're eligible to to be displayed despite the ad blocker, right? But you have to, abide by those things, called the acceptable ad standard. So that is quite interesting. That is a quite unique take on ads in general, that if you behave well, we'll show it. If you're not, then we won't. But that also means that, and of course, there's you have to monetize that in some way as well. So smaller publishers, you want to make sure that they don't contribute to this effort, financially, but the bigger ones can, contribute towards this so that you can make it sustainable, the whole acceptable ads sort of effort over there. So having said this, there's a lot of people who are trying to circumvent the ad blocker to show you ads. And usually if they find a way to circumvent the ad blocker and to show you ads, they can do anything. They can make the most weird, the most, invasive, the most in-your-face ad possible, because there's no one to stop them, right? So those are some of the worst ads that you should never see. So that's where circumvention comes in. So circumvention is the act, or ad filtering circumvention is the act of getting around the ad blocker or ad filtering software that you have to show you the ads. And when I joined eyeo, I joined a team called Anti-Circumvention, which the whole point was to take a look at these techniques and sort of like block them. And that was quite a interesting, dive into the whole space, because that wasn't something that I ever even thought about beforehand. I never even thought about that. This is entire companies which the whole point of them is to get around the ad blocker and to show people ads, and to go to advertisers and say, hey, even if the person has an ad blocker, we are capable of showing people ads, and so give us the money and stuff. So that was quite interesting to learn these different techniques and sort of like come up with ways to stop that kind of practice. So that was interesting. I did a whole talk about this actually in a few years ago at JSConf. Maybe you can put it down in the show notes sometime.
Yeah, I'll definitely put your talk on that subject in the show notes. But is there like a quick summary version that you can share with us? Like maybe 2-3 points?
Yeah, I mean, usually what we came up with, as a short and medium term approach was what I called small hits matter. So what I basically said was, there's a number of these different techniques that different people are using to get around the ad blocker. And we can spend a huge amount of time in developing this perfect tool to block all kinds of things, or we can, experiment and do some small, testing on a few more things which are not as high tech. Maybe, there are some things which we know that if we deploy that, they're gonna, come back to and sort of like circumvent that, very, very quickly. But if we do it, aggressively enough, and if we do it robustly enough, after a while, they'll get the message that this technique will not work in the long term. So hopefully they will stop. So that is one of the things that we have sort of like done in the past, which is just essentially just be very, very, what's the right word over here? Just very, very aggressive and very, very, what's the word of not giving up?
Resilience, persistence?
Persistence, yes. We were really, really persistent in just, having relatively low tech ways to just basically counter what they're doing. So they make a change in their website. We have a filter list update to sort of like, they make another change. We push out another change. There's not a huge machine learning model that we had built that, at that time. There's not like huge, really, really complicated algorithms that we were building at that time. We were just taking a look at what they're doing and just very quickly countering what they're making filterless changes to counter that. Very, very. So in the initial days, that was what was happening with our approach. And yeah, that was quite interesting to see. Over time, we took a look at more complicated, more advanced techniques. We even built a whole team which is doing a lot of good work in machine learning and AI to take a look at so many of these techniques. But yeah, in the initial days, it was just doing things that don't scale.
Nice. I like it. It's like an arms race for like who has, you're building more code to counter the other sort of faction.
Yeah. It was basically, it is still like this. It's a cat and mouse game.
My God.
Usually people don't think about this. People that's the interesting thing about a product like an Adblocker, which is that if you make a great product and if you do your job well, then ideally your user should not even think about you or your product, right? I mean, it should just be in the background, right? It's just blocking ads and you're just, going about your day. Like the moment you're thinking about the ad blocker, really 9 times out of 10 is because you're seeing an ad that you don't like and you're thinking, why hasn't my ad blocker blocked that? So yeah. If you do your job well, in this case, it's just staying in the background.
Yeah. And I think the irony of all of this is that, the people who are like, we want to show ads to people who have ad blocks on, is that person doesn't actually want to see ads. So why are you trying to even show them ads to begin with? It's like, you're not understanding the psychology of the person who's trying to block those ads. But maybe there's some other more nuanced thinking there in terms of it's not binary. It's like a vector, and there's way more to it. Because, for example, I've heard this thing from this Professor Galloway, and he talks about this, that ads are for poor people. Rich people just buy subscriptions and they just avoid seeing any ads. Mm-hmm. So, if you get a premium membership, like I have YouTube Premium, for example, I can't stand ads at all. But in some cases, you just don't have a choice. And then, for example, I think there's like these blockers for, like, if you want to read like the New York Times, they have like a paid wall and you can circumvent that. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's part of like the same space, or I think that's like a sort of completely different sort of, that's a different, yeah. Okay. Okay. So I think, so sort of from this browser journey and sort of, how they sort of use the same engine, and there's sort of these different technologies. And now even with Mighty App, the focus being that, we're going to process everything in the cloud versus your local machine. And then, sort of privacy, how that's seen. And then I think there's, at an OS level, what's happening in terms of blocking, what access to third parties get to the user data. And then there's that browser layer. And then there's, of course, apps and all that stuff, all these different layers. And in a way, Adblock Plus is bringing sort of its own philosophy to the space, that they're saying that, okay, or is that like a standard that you were talking about, that the kind of ads that we're going to show or block, or is that a global standard?
I mean, yeah, it is a standard which a lot of people are sort of like subscribing to, not from the advertising end especially. So, and there's others as well. There's the Coalition for Better Ads, called the CBA, and a few others as well. So okay. But the main thing, actually, you made a really interesting point about what Scott Galloway had said, which is about ads are for poor people and rich people buy subscriptions. There is a lot of truth to it, but I still do see a lot of people who are, I wouldn't call like quote unquote poor, but they just simply are just tired of doing subscriptions all the time, and they're like, but still the online ad experience sucks. So, but the interesting thing over here is that if we block all ads all the time, then what it does is it creates a tiered system, sort of like a class system on the internet, where people who can afford to pay will get access to good journalism, for example. They will get access to good subscriptions and everything else. But the people who cannot afford to pay or do not have a credit card or something like this, which also includes like teenagers and stuff like that, those are sort of like locked away, right? From good quality journalism or good quality content online. So having a good, healthy online ecosystem right now is highly dependent upon advertising, whether we like it or not, right? Unless we figure out some other way to monetize content, which goes beyond, using your credit cards or using some kind of monetary exchange of value. I mean, unless we figure that out, this is the best way, unfortunately, that we have when it comes to. And coming from the other perspective, if you're a small startup, right, or even if you're like a decent, small to medium business, advertising is a good way to get the word out. Otherwise, you're sort of like relying on word of mouth, or you're relying upon, having a sales team calling people up and all those kind of things. So, it does have genuine use cases as well. At some point, online advertising goes from genuinely being useful to creepy. And we want to make sure, like us all, the internet, I think all of us are of the opinion that, that should not happen. But advertising or online advertising, we shouldn't paint everything with the same brush, right? People can find and do find value from both sides when it comes to this. And if you take away all of this, then it's sort of like is creating sort of like a tiered system within the internet of the haves and the have-nots.
I love your perspective on this, by the way. First point is that I would have never imagined that a tiny little browser extension, there's actually people behind it who are thinking about all of these sort of nuanced philosophical, from a business perspective, people's experience perspective, ecosystem. There's all of this stuff happening behind the scenes and these conversations are probably happening within your teams. And I think we should touch on, teams and working with people and getting them aligned and on some of these philosophical things, because it's like you're also debating internally, as somebody who's building this product like Adblocker Plus, is how do you make money, right? And how do you find that sweet spot between creating a great ecosystem, but also a great experience for the people using the internet, and making sure that it's accessible, that, that there's like this democratic sort of approach to it. But at the same time, there's that capital intent towards the whole enterprise, because you're paying salaries and you got to still pay engineers and develop all that stuff. I mean, there's so much to unpack here. This is wow. So I think I would love to start with, and this is something I think that you've been doing, that you've been writing about teams and leadership and some of these aspects. And I think that plays into how do you align people within your team to start thinking about these things? And then how do you sort of connect that dots from a revenue, top line, bottom line perspective? Because some of these things are not necessarily capital intensive ideas where you're thinking about how will we make more money, right? You're actually thinking, how do people have a better experience? So the lens is sort of more thinking about the user first, thinking more about the ecosystem first, thinking about accessibility, some of those things, and then how that turns into a vision, how that turns into product ideas.
I mean, when I was at eyeo, we were thinking, and I assume like they're still thinking about this. It is something which is at the heart of the company, because it's doing ad filtering, right? So, of course, they're thinking quite a lot about this, right from the C's to all the business units to everything else as well. So what I was doing at that time was thinking about not just the product, but more the overall industry, and the overall direction of the web as well. And talking about some of the stuff that we've sort of like mentioned beforehand as well. Why are ad blockers necessary? Why is ad filtering necessary? What would happen if we go scorched earth in one respect, and block all ads? Then what will happen on the internet ecosystem, right? But also we were thinking about, what is the future of ad filtering in terms of like the devices that are being used, right? So Adblock Plus, for example, it started out as a browser extension, right? And browser extensions are pretty much desktop only, right? But more and more, like people are using the web nowadays on mobile, right? It's not even a contest. Like more people primarily now use the web on their mobile. So how do we make sure that ad filtering is still there and possible on mobile platforms? Like can that kind of like solution be integrated in different mobile browsers, for example? And what is the future in terms of circumvention? What are the problems that we are facing? And also, what are the things that we can do? What are the investments that we can do that maybe not this year, but next year or a few years down the line can really pay dividends in terms of, once again, AI and machine learning, and stuff regarding that. So those were kind of like the things that we had to do. One of the things that I did end up doing was lobby internally in terms of the need for AI and machine learning efforts, and sort of like found a whole team whose whole purpose is to develop AI efforts to counter many of these circumvention efforts, and they're doing really, really well right now. I'm quite proud of them. So that is some of the thoughts that we've been having in that space. Overall, there's also, like, people don't realize, but there's also a whole open source community around ad blocking. The main, like, if you're using any kind of ad blocker, it's using it's most probably using at least a filter list called EasyList. And that is a globally, it's a global open source effort by a bunch of volunteers who take a look at all these different websites and sort of add filter rules to filter out, the ads. So how can we support them? How do we contribute to them? And over time, I especially, one of the things that I ended up, taking over was this thing that eyeo does, a conference called the Ad Filtering Developer Summit. So, that's one of the things that I took a look at, when I was there, and sort of like scaled up the conference to ask people from different browsers, different ad filtering, companies, and to come and participate and talk about the different issues. The one which is happening this year, I think it's happening in October, early October sometime. So anyone who would want to know a little bit more about the whole thing, that would be a nice conference to check out.
We'll put the links to that in the show notes for the people listening or watching. So I think all the things that you talked about, like if you talk like more like management terms, as a leader, you're talking more about the future value, not necessarily obviously addressing the present and current concerns. Yeah. But you're looking at the macro. You're not just looking at your own product. You're looking at sort of the ecosystem. You're also looking at, all these other aspects that touch this. Some might be like a direct line, some might be a dotted line, and you're sort of factoring in all these different things. So as a leader, before you even get into like the what are we going to make, and how are we going to do it, you're thinking about, okay, what does this macro look like? Where's the internet and this sort of whole ecosystem going? And how do I take all of that, start translating it into, from a vision perspective to, okay, now bite size and then actionable steps. And then that, I think you talked about, implementing like an AI team. So do you want to talk a little bit about, from that leadership perspective, how you sort of approach it, and then how that eventually then gets trickled down into, something on a Trello board? It's like an action item then, and how that sort of takes effect
Yeah. So as a, at eyeo, we were, going through, a few years ago, a big sort of like a reorg. And, during this reorg, I was tasked as one of the people helping out in establishing a whole business unit and sort of like going and establishing the vision, the mission of it, and coming up with, proper team structures within it. So, and the idea over there was that, this was core technology. The name of the business unit was core technology. So what, if you really had to go and define the core technology of ad filtering, what would that be? We obviously wanted to keep the element of anti-circumvention, because that is sort of the reality of the whole situation. People try to circumvent the Adblocker. We want to we still be part of that cat and mouse game, right? So that is something that we wanted to still have. So that was one of the teams that we sort of like had in that business unit. As I said, we took a look at what the future would be and what are the things that we would want to, invest towards. And AI was there. So we had a team which was focused on, AI efforts on countering ad filtering, right? And we knew that initially there won't be a lot of stuff coming out from this team. They need to, we need to set up this team from scratch. We need to, at that time there wasn't a quote unquote AI team in the company. So, just thinking about the whole, idea of an AI team, there is a little bit of a skewed expectation, right? Usually in when it comes to teams, they're delivering stuff that programmers are making, right? And it's what to expect. But when it comes to AI, you're dealing with probabilities. You're making a trained machine learning model, which will not work 100% of the time in all different cases, right? There's a probability that things may not work. And you have to be okay with that kind of probability as well, right? So just having or setting the expectations on that team was something that was quite interesting in terms of internal communication to that team, but also the external communication of what we should expect from that team to other teams, right? So that was one of the teams. Then there's a lot of code which goes into the extension itself from a core perspective, like the core set of modules, for example, you could say, that goes into the actual, the extension. That was one of the teams that we found as well. And then the last one was all about filter lists. That I told you about the whole global sort of open source effort that is there. And similar to those, there's other filter lists as well that are being used for different softwares for implementing ad blocking. So this team was essentially just taking a look at filter lists, how to optimize them, how to make sure that there's no defects over there. And this was all about that. So we took a look at all the different components that go into the core technology of ad filtering, and also a big bet regarding AI, and we put that over there. So from a organized or team org perspective, or a company org perspective, that was quite interesting for us to take a look at. Now, when it comes to that, was just defining the teams and making sure that we set up the teams, right? But what we also wanted to do as a unit was to make sure that all of them work together as much as necessary to achieve our objectives. So we wanted to make sure that we, as a unit, regularly come and discuss about our strategy. What do we want to do? Whether it is in line with the company's strategy, at least for that year. What are the OKRs that we want to work towards? And stuff like that. So once we had our company OKRs, then we made based on this our business unit OKRs. And then
by the way, sorry, just want to interrupt you quickly. Did you happen to see this tweet by Sundar Pichai where there's somebody tweeted OKRs and SciPop? I don't know if you saw that tweet or.
Yeah, I did.
By the way, so So I would love for you to sort of expand on that. Like, what does that mean? And I'll throw it up on the screen for people who might be watching this. Do you want to give us a little bit of a quick, because I didn't even know what OKRs are. And it's like, again, you get into like industry lingo, a taxonomy, acronym, 3-letter acronym and ninjas.
Yeah, so OKRs are generally just a technique that organizations use to sort of like define in a way, what work that they want to do and what outcomes do they want to achieve, right? So OKRs are essentially objectives and key results. So O for objectives and KR for key results. And there's a lot of companies which are now adopting, the OKR, framework to essentially plan out their strategy and their work. So now the thing is that the tweet that Sundar Pichai sort of liked was a sarcastic sort of tweet, which was a lot of times people put a lot of effort into defining the OKRs, right? And companies which sometimes shouldn't even start doing that because they're just too early to really take benefit of it. And that was the whole tweet, that that is something. OKRs were something that has been around since the time of Intel, but it was really popularized by taking Google's example. So this was sort of like the tweet saying that by using Google's example, they've sort of slowed down a lot of different startups. And what I actually also quote tweeted this, where I said that essentially that the OKRs are a tool. They can be very useful for organizations, but for many products which are 0 to 1 efforts, they're not as useful. You can still make it work, but they're not as useful if you haven't even defined what the product is. You're still looking for product.
Right. That actually makes a lot of sense, that you can't just use something, find a framework online and be like, okay, let me start using this. There's like context, there's timing, there's all of this stuff, that an amateur or somebody new might not know. And that's where, if you have somebody who's an expert or somebody who can help and guide you at what tool or what framework to use when. But I think going back to what you were saying, even before you got into the teams aspect, I think there's a really beautiful blog article that you've written called Ambitious Leadership. And even before sort of setting up those teams, you've taken a really good analogy here, is voyages, marathons, and sprints. And then, you're also sort of talking about, how to identify the problem and do all that upfront work. And why I'm bringing up that article and some of those points is because even before you set up that team, you probably had to make a business case to your seniors to give a green light to this. So do you want to sort of talk us through maybe some points from that blog article that you wrote, Ambitious Leadership, and maybe and if you can, provided it's not under like NDA and stuff and it's not sensitive, but how you sort of built that business case to help to then get you going on building that team and then bringing that vision to life.
Yeah. So when it comes to that blog post, that I was really inspired by the story of Shackleton. Have you heard of that? No. So Ernest Shackleton, the explorer in the 1920s, I think. There was this race of going to the South Pole, and that was won by not by Shackleton, by someone else. But he said, okay, let me just take another stab at a world record, which was going to the South Pole and sort of crossing by land the entire the width of it. So he set up a whole crew. He went over there, and then disaster struck. The ship that they were on, called the Endurance, that got muddled and stuck in ice water, and they couldn't go further. They spent, I think, about 9 or 10 months, around the ship, and then it sank. And they had to take, all the stuff that they had from that ship, everything that they could manage to salvage, off. And, then they sort of like, walked and walked and walked. And afterwards they were like, okay, nothing will happen over here. We need to take a call and sort of, try to see if we can get to some kind of human civilization somehow. And they had a few, they had one boat, not the ship, just a rescue boat.
Yeah.
And they couldn't get everyone over there. So they had the captain and a few others. And they took on a journey, which was, by the way, that area of the world has some of the most violent seas imaginable. Yeah. So essentially the way in which Shackleton somehow miraculously, despite all odds, ended up saving, all the lives of all the crew, all 29 of them, I think. And that included, a sailboat journey across thousands of miles. That included trekking across a whole island in the cold. That is something which is stuff of legends. It's still one of those things which, people talk about and discuss in business schools and in everything else. What is that kind of leadership? And in the blog post, I sort of like said that sometimes, there's some things where the goals are smaller, right? Those are sort of like sprints, not the agile sprint, but just literal sprints, right? Then there's some things which are voyages, and there's some things which are just, larger efforts over there.
There's definitely some really good points in that story. And what we'll do is we'll put the blog article that you wrote, which sort of outlines the whole story, the takeaways and all that stuff. We'll put that in the show notes for people listening. So I think the distinction that you're making is that, there's some things that sort of are sprints, then there are marathons, the long game, and then there's voyages, which is like the big macro view. And then I think the story ties in with that leadership aspect of at times of like planning and visioning, but also in times of crisis. And that story demonstrates, how he demonstrated his leadership during that time of crisis. But of course, I think if you had to sort of summarize your one point from that entire story and that blog for the sake of this conversation, what would that be?
It would be that sometimes as leaders, you have to set really ambitious goals, and you have to be careful because sometimes it might take too much out of your teammates. But if you do set some ambitious goals, the only way to meet those ambitious goals would be to really change the game, right?
Right.
If you want just a 1% improvement, that can be done without changing the game, even a 10% improvement. If you go for more than this, if you go for 100% improvement, then it would require doing something or implementing something or thinking about something in a very radical way, right?
Right.
And sometimes you would want to do that, right? So
right.
As leaders,
like them going off on a small boat to find some land or some other civilization that they could go find some sort of rescue in.
Yeah. And that's one of those things which is just, if you read the blog post, you'll see, there are elements of some things which are really, really time sensitive, not as ambitious, but really important that you want to do as sprints. Then there's some things on the other end, which are just really, voyages. You have to take those that are extremely ambitious, and that requires just thinking in a completely different way, right? Sometimes you wouldn't want to do that as teams.
That's a fantastic story. So now when you connect it back to sort of the context of eyeo, and so you have this vision, you see the big picture of the voyage in terms of where the internet, how people use the internet, on their phones, how the browser sort of fits into that ecosystem. So you have the vision / voyage aspect in your brain. And now you have to go present that as a business case to your executives. So how does that then, what did you actually end up doing, and what kind of, without you don't have to go into the details if you don't want to, but what did you actually end up doing? And what story did you tell them to convince them to give you the funding to bring in a team and start getting into the marathon and the sprints part of it?
Yeah, I mean, once again, it has to do with, as leaders, your goal setting as well, right? And that goal setting has to have some kind of logic towards it to convince other people. In my case, I can give you sort of like two examples. One of them being, once again, the AI team. So we knew from our previous experience of how advanced many of these circumvention providers are, and there's only so much that you could do with conventional techniques. And even though we were doing a lot of things which don't scale, we were doing a pretty good job of it. But we sort of talked about this trend. We talked about the fact that it's a cat and mouse game. We come up with a technique, they come up with a better technique, and then we counter with another technique and they come up with a better technique. So over time, conventional approaches will only get us so far, and we have to take a look at things like machine learning, with the idea being that it might be more generalized, so that whatever technique that they tried might be more resilient to those techniques. And that was sort of like the bet that we had, right? That was one of those things. The other thing that we were thinking about was the whole idea of, where the industry is going in terms of, ad filtering on different devices, and there being, ad blocking in browser extensions, but there's also a lot of stuff going on nowadays. People are consuming the web on their mobile phones. How do we make sure that we have a performant and reliable sort of like ad filtering solution on that can work on mobile phones, for example, or more constrained devices? And our experience was that, okay, there's a lot of challenges here, and we might need to actually overhaul our code over here and sort of like make it much more performant. This is sort of like an example of that really ambitious goal setting where you need to then completely change the way in which things are done. So we said, okay, if you really want to have a performant and reliable solution on mobile, maybe we should think about changing even the programming language of where it's being used. So instead of using JavaScript, we might use something like C++, which is a little bit more, which is way more performant on many of these like embedded devices. But that is a huge effort. That's a huge undertaking. But we managed to, do that, across multiple different months with many different teams working together. And that is something which I think was an example of that as well. So I know you did talk about a lot about like how these conversations were potentially happening internally at the company, but if it's for people listening and who might be in the position where they have to take a business case to their executive or their senior, are there any learnings from that experience that you could share that might be helpful in how to maybe present it, or how to put that information together, or what are the things to be aware of in terms of how to sort of even package that for the execs? Any thoughts there that you could recall, or any memories, or any impediments that came, any challenges that came in terms of having those conversations, or how that sort of organically happened? Or what I would say is that, and I don't know, a lot of people don't really talk about this, but when presenting such big things to executives, one thing that I would say is that these things should not be a complete surprise to them. You would in some way, shape or form, maybe not the whole thing, but in some small pieces, sort of like talk to them beforehand as well, and sort of like even work with them to analyze the whole market, to analyze what trends are going on in the industry, and sort of like build your case beforehand and talk about what you're planning, what you're doing, so that it's not a complete surprise to the Cs, for example, that you have this plan coming up, right? That gets people on board because they're much more on board already. They're seeing your point of view. So that's one of those things. there needs to be an element of doing your homework in terms of just your analysis of the market and what your capabilities are. But also there needs to be some kind of bet that you have, right? A strategy is usually some kind of bet. It's a plan which you think is giving you the best odds for success for your goal, right? And usually these are things where you say, we're going to do it this way instead of this other way, which might also be a good way. But we're choosing it this way because that's our strategy, right? That is also a bet, right? And convincing other people that this is the way to give you the best odds for success, that is also something that you have to make the case for, right? And that requires discussing trade-offs. That requires discussing, the pros and cons for different approaches. The amount of resources, for example, that you might put into an AI team could also go into some other team, right? The amount of money, the amount of the kind of skill sets that you use for those. So there's always trade-offs, and then you would be in a position. You need to be in a position to stand behind your choices and explain the trade-offs, explain why your method is better than some other solution, which might be also good, right? So, and not completely trash them. Like that might be some other person's idea. So those are elements that I think would be quite nice. I mean, in terms of just a general, solution that can be generally applied to everyone else, right? Overall, when it comes to presenting, I think, just making sure that it's not a complete surprise to everyone, getting people on board, at least with small elements of what you're planning. And then going on from there, like in terms of just making sure that you explain your trade-offs.
Yeah. You know what? So I was talking to another friend of mine, and he's in the sort of the banking sector and finance. And he's like, the sign-off meeting or the approval for that plan meeting is a formality. So that's not where the decision is made. The decision has been made previously. So to your point, you're having these conversations, and it's a collaborative effort, and you're not going and presenting this thing and they're like, what is this? Yeah. So that executive buy-in is a bunch of conversations that happen in a collaborative way where you're building it together. And then there's this one sort of final sign off where, that is like approval, and it's more of like a formality, and depending on sort of the size of the org. So I think that trickles not only in product and sort of that space, but also in very large scale corporates like finance and banking and stuff. So I totally resonated with that point that you made. That was spot on. And then two, I think the other thing that you were touching on is you're sort of hedging a bet, and you're sort of looking and forecasting into the future, and you're sort of also looking at, where to allocate those resources and how to, so some of those aspects where you're having like strategy in a sense is like a POV on how you see this. And then the plan is going to help you enable that POV. Yeah. And a lot of times people get confused with like a really laid out plan as strategy, but that's the strategy dictates that plan. And I think if you want us to talk a little bit about that, where people sort of confuse planning and Excel sheets and Gantt charts with strategy. I think strategy is the POV of like, this is that white space, or this is where the opportunity is. And then the plan helps you sort of get there.
Yeah. I mean, you have your vision and your mission, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have your specific, plans, your specific, things to do, your initiatives and everything else. Strategy is something which comes in between.
Right.
And as I said, that's one of those things which usually is quite misunderstood. A lot of people confuse strategy with, this is just, a bunch of Excel like sheets that we need to do, or a bunch of these different tasks that we need to do, or these revenue numbers that we need to hit. usually that's not a strategy. A strategy is, some kind of approach that you are using, right, to achieve that mission and that vision that you have. So if you want to climb that mountain, or if you want to go to one place to the other, right, one way to do that would be to fly to that place. The other thing could be to use.
Yes. That's a really good analogy. That's a really good analogy. That it's where you're going is a strategy, and how you're going there is the plan. I think in our industry, like in advertising, there's this oxymoron, or like this paradoxical statement. It says strategic planning. Like, what does that even mean? Because planning is something else and strategy is something else. Based
on your strategy, then you can plan. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
But the strategy thing comes first. Once again, you can do even half and half. You can say, I'm gonna, drive half the way and then fly half the way, or something like.
Yeah.
And it depends. Then you go into more interesting things. What is if you want to go from point A to point B, you might want to choose, a vehicle. It depends on the terrain, right? It depends upon whether there's well-marked roads or not, and all those different kind of things. So then you go into, if you have to create that, analogy, you take a look at the market, you take a look at your competitors, you take a look at, what's going on in terms of your own capabilities and where you want to invest things. And then you go on to many other of these different things. But you need to come up with your approach on what do you, on how do you want to achieve that goal, and what gives you the best odds for success, right? Some other plan or some other way to achieve that might also be good, but it, in your opinion, might not give you as good odds of success as the one that you're choosing, right? So that is something which people sometimes sort of like miss when it comes to strategy.
Some really good points there, man. I'm definitely learning a lot in terms of how some of the, the cadence and steps that are being followed in terms of how that thinking happens. And, from a vision standpoint, and sort of identifying what the gaps are in the market or where the industry might be going in the future. So that future value aspect of it. And then how we start paving the path to get to that outcome, in the future. So, okay. So now you've talked about sort of, identifying at a high level what the voyage is, or what that vision is, and then figuring out, okay, what's our 5-year plan? And now you've got the business case approved. And now you're thinking, okay, tactfully, what are the things I need to do? And then you also talked about the team aspect. So do you want to let's start with the team aspect of things, of how do you identify a team? How do you hire? All those things that happen in bringing the right people who have the shared vision. And I'm going to actually let you sort of take it away and talk about some of those.
Sometimes as leaders, you might be in a position to establish a team. Usually speaking, you're not establishing a team, though. Usually you're inheriting a team, right? So
that's a good point. That not everybody gets a chance to hire fresh, and you might inherit. Okay, so great point. Keep going. Yeah.
And when you're inheriting a team, it has sometimes some teams are great, and then there's sometimes where teams are struggling. And you need to identify which teams are which. You need to identify some of the dysfunctions of a team, especially when it comes to things like not just whether the team is actually delivering, but some of the reasons why. Whether there's enough trust in the team, whether there's enough psychological safety amongst all of the people within the team. Whether they have the right resources to do their job, whether they're being influenced by a lot of different stakeholders, and there's no real shield for them. As a leader, as a manager, you would need to take a look at these teams and see, where do they need help, where do they need reinforcements, and just essentially talk with them quite a lot and observe them as well. So what are the things that they're particularly good at? What are the things that they're struggling at? What kind of help do they need and whom? So those are things that I took a look at as well. There were a couple of teams that I sort of like inherited in that sense. And there were a few teams that we made from scratch as well, which then went into, what kind of people do we want to hire, right? So if you have a team where everyone is, 10 years experienced and, super, super senior, people think that that's a great team, but that may not be the case. In the real world, there'll be a clash of egos. There'll be, a bunch of things here and there. So, and overall, like in general, for the health of the organization, it's not always good to just have all seniors all the time. You would want to have a mix of people with different experiences and different experience levels, different perspectives. So how do you hire in terms of bringing in that diversity, right? And we're talking about gender diversity as well. We're talking about, diversity in terms of if you're making a global team, is everyone just from the same country or is from different regions, what their prior experience has been, So hiring is a big part of setting up that team as well. And a lot of times we've gone on and took a chance with person who's a little bit more junior because we thought that, okay, they have potential, but also they can be a good person to be as part of this team where the other people are a bunch of seniors. And that could be also a good way to make sure that, a person who's a little bit more junior can also bring their own brand of energy, if you pick the right candidates, right? And they can ask the right questions to get along with people and serve as a glue. So depending upon that personality as well, that can be the right fit. So, those are things which are important for especially leaders who are setting up these teams to take a look at. What are the markers of team health? What are the markers of team dysfunction? How are people getting along with each other? And also sometimes what happens is teams can also get into this mode of us versus the world, that the business is asking us to do this, but we're fighting against them. And you would want to make sure that they're also on board with the company strategy and the unit strategy, right? And you're not going into this us versus the world kind of thing. So yeah, there's a bunch of things for managers to keep an eye on.
Yeah. And you know what, so let's go sort of one by one into some of these things. And I really am curious, like how you sort of tackle some of these things. So if we start with where you sort of ended is us versus them. So if that is the case and you've just been put in charge of a team and you've sort of, to that point you said earlier, that we've inherited a team and, there might be quite a bit of senior people and, there is that sort of us versus them mentality. So what are the steps that you might start taking or conversations you might start having? What would you do in that, or how have you sort of handled that sort of situation in the past?
Yeah, I mean, if you're inheriting a team, then, before the part of inheriting that team, you didn't have control over who was coming into that team or not. In my position, I was then, in that position of, okay, hiring more for this team to expand it, right? So I took a look at, okay, what are the things that this team needs more of? And one of the things that particular team needed more of was someone who was a little bit more in tune with the outside perspective of, by outside, I mean, looking beyond the immediate interests of the team. The more higher you go, the more senior you become, usually speaking, you would need to think about not just the immediate interests of your team, but also, the company in general. And sometimes you would need to make a call where it's not in the direct interest of your team, but it's in the direct interest of the broader company. For example, sometimes the company might need on a short term, resources or engineers from your team to work on something else, which is like way more important in the short term, and you have to be sort of like okay with that, right? Sometimes that can happen. Like you can also fight it. You can say, hey, over my dead body, this engineer is not going to go over there. But it might make sense genuinely for the company, right, in the short term. And you would need, you need personalities which can understand, who have that maturity to understand many of these, complicated, nuanced sort of discussions. And when you're hiring for people, you would need to sense that as well in your hiring process and have the appropriate, questions or, behavioral sort of like techniques to find that out, right? So, and sensing that maturity and experience. So, that is one of those things that makes sense. Having said that, also a lot of times what happens is that, apart from hiring people, what about the people who are already there? So making sure that you have conversations with them, in a very candid way, sort of like explaining, what exactly is the company strategy or the business strategy, and how it translates to them and their work. A lot of times the translation work hasn't been done properly. So they don't really see how their work is really affecting the company. They cannot really make that sense. They cannot. So making sure that you do that translation work is also part of leadership. And it can be the team leader, it can be the VP, it can be the C. Everyone needs to do their part, right? But in terms of just making sure that whoever is the team leader can explain that strategy and how that translates to every individual's work, that a lot of times can do wonders as well.
Two things that I take away from this is, one is, and this is something that I would recommend to literally everyone, is learn how your client or how your company makes money and how what you're doing is connected to revenue and how it's connected to bottom line and how the efforts that you're putting in day to day lead to the company making money. Because if you can have that skill, number one, you can have much higher resolution conversations, especially if you're client facing. And two, if you are seeking a promotion or seeking to bring in inputs and all that stuff, you can have a much more informed conversation with your boss, because now you can connect what you're doing with, KPIs and measurable sort of results. So I totally, and I think in the case that you sort of described, that you're sometimes in the absence of that can also lead to us versus them, because they just don't know how what they're doing is now connected to the business. And I think there's also a second part to that. I think there's also, and this is true for like service-based businesses and some sort of, I'm sure there's definitely, a dotted line and connecting dots in terms of the incentive structure of how those teams are structured. Do they have their own P&L, or is it a cost center? And if there's any thoughts that you want to sort of double click into that aspect of, how maybe the companies that you work with have been structured, and that can affect the behavior of, because now their behavior is incentivized to do a certain thing, but you're asking them to do a certain thing. So how do you counterbalance some of those conflicting situations?
Yeah, that is surprisingly common as well. Coming back to your previous point, I think it's especially common where a lot of the team's effort sometimes is what I call, or what people call KTLOs, like keep the lights on. Like this is sometimes the work which is not even visible to the client. Sometimes it's work that's a lot of times operational work or work which is just there to, if you don't do it, then you don't have a product, or you will have a severely degraded product. So it's necessary for you to do, but it's not the sexy work. It's not like some work that is particularly innovative or something. It's just work that keeps the machine going, right? And you do need people and teams a lot of times to make that happen. And a lot of times people from those teams sort of like are wondering, how is this connected to the bottom line? This is just regular work that needs to be done. And then you have to, that's where leaders can come in and sort of make sure that they not make them realize that, yeah, it is really important work, that if this doesn't get done, then we might not have a good company. So it does require like framing, the work that they're doing in terms of not the value that they're bringing in terms of dollar amounts, but in terms of opportunity cost, or in terms of, okay, if this doesn't happen, then we don't have anything a lot of times.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. I think there's this thing called the Stan Shi smile curve, where I don't know if you've seen this, but there is, here, I'll just share it with you right now so that you can see it. And then, for the people listening, I'm going to throw it up on the screen. So if you're watching this, you can see it. Let me just quickly show it to you so that we can just quickly, just for your sense, Shwetank. So if you see this, the Stan Shi, I don't know, it's SHIH smile curve, is that, so if you look at, what are the things that sit high up on the value chain in terms of the value being brought, and like manufacturing and operations sitting at the bottom of that smile. Of course, we don't have to go deep into this specific sort of thing, but this is sort of where, that very operational thing. So, in that Stan smile curve, operations sitting at the bottom of that curve, and it does not necessarily get that, it doesn't get that visibility and optics play in terms of, people who are more at the forefront of like, R&D, innovation, and brand and marketing. These are things that are like need to happen every day. They're very operations heavy, and you're right. They might not necessarily connect to the bottom line and in a like a direct line, but there's a dotted line, because there's a cascading sort of domino effect leading. Yeah. So totally lined up with sort of what you're saying.
Yeah, it's also one of those things where, if the team, like a lot of times, like, there's some people who have said to me, in conversations that, if this team doesn't do its work for like a day or something, it won't matter. But that might actually even be true in the sense that if the whole team is on vacation for like a day or even 2 days, maybe okay. But over time, you would see a significant drop in, the quality or the stuff that the team is known for, or the company is, or the product is known for. So, that is something that needs to be figured out. Like, for example, fraud prevention. It's just a never-ending battle of new things coming in. And if you're making a fintech product, you would need to make sure that you're on top of, these issues, right? You might, even if you're like missing a day or two, that's not going to kill the company, right? But over time, if you lose your edge on fraud prevention, for example, it's not going to be good for a fintech product to be in that space, right? So it's one of those things which you need to make sure that you find the right ways of explaining the value of what the team is doing, so that the morale is high as well.
I think you're right. Like, I think if we connect it back to sort of the analogy that we've been taking of voyages and marathons and sprints, is that, in case of a plane, you have a pilot that needs to help the plane take off and land. But then once it's up in the air, it's coasting, you can put it on autopilot. So even if the pilot gets up for a bit to take a break, eat, it's like the company's not going to go in jeopardy over like a short break. But then you still need that operations and that team to land it, to taxi it and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a nice analogy over there.
Yeah. So anyway, so you were talking about so the first aspect of it is where we're talking about knowing that what efforts they're putting in, how that's maybe a dotted line to business outcomes, or a direct line to the revenue that company generates. And then so what happens sort of after that?
after that, I mean, you go into specific, like if you do OKRs, then you talk about OKRs. If you have some other like goal setting framework, you use that. But as managers, I mean, those are things that can be learned, and especially OKRs if you're adopting it for the first time as a team, you're not gonna get it right. It takes a few tries to really come up with good OKRs, which are outcome based, which are not just a list of initiatives and tasks, or just a list of milestones or something. Really thinking about what outcome do you want, which will be a marker of success, and then come up with key results. That takes a little bit of time, right? So you have to give the teams that you're managing a little bit of slack when it comes to this as well. But overall, like when it comes to team culture, you just you also have to think about, in general, many of these conversations will be about specific discussions which are happening. Like, for example, should we adopt this technique or not? And one of the things that I've written about is this whole thing about NIH syndrome, or not invented here syndrome. A lot of times, teams sort of push back against anything which is external, and they favor their own homegrown tools or their homegrown sort of way of thinking, and sort of like pushing back against anything which is new. And this is so much of a common thing that's called NIH syndrome, or not invented here syndrome. So it's one of those things that you have to keep a watch out for. The other thing, which is sort of like similarly connected, is sort of like what I call institutional exceptionalism, where it's like, yeah, this thing really worked, or this best practice really worked for this company or that product, but it's never going to work over here. We're different, so that happens so much in so many teams. That
yeah. You know what that brings me to is like, so I'm pretty sure, with egos and, with NIH syndrome, not invented here, or, that it won't work in our context, is you have conflict. And so how do you deal with maybe difficult people, or these kind of conflicts? Because it's like, it's not about that one person and that one use case. It's about what's this company, what voyage are we on? And then what's the marathon that this team is running, and what are the sprints that need to happen? If it's like a baton race, so, you're thinking about the whole relay race, whereas that employee is just thinking about his part of handing it over to the next person.
Yeah, sometimes, it depends upon the type of conflict as well, right? A lot of times, I've seen conflict happen, and it turns out that, they're probably, like, they are actually thinking relatively similarly. They're just wording it different. So sometimes, it's just human behavior is just so different a lot of times. Sometimes it has to do with, both are making good points. It's just that one doesn't like the other person. And they're just they made a point. They're not going to back down. So sometimes that happens as well. And a lot of
how do you develop that skill? Because when these kind of sort of conflicts or confrontations or conversations are happening, your ability to see beyond just yourself and your point of view and really empathize and have cognitive empathy for that other person. What are they saying? Because to see through that, actually, this person is saying the same thing. He's just using, or they're using different words to communicate it. And they're just sort of coming at it like this. But ultimately, we're both looking at an elephant. Mm-hmm. How do you sort of develop that skill? And are there any things that you personally do to sort of sharpen that skill? Or,
well, in my case, when it's a good, for me, it was good that I wasn't part of those teams. Like, I was the manager, sort of like I was the business unit head, and the teams had their own like product managers, engineering managers, and stuff like that. So I was one step removed, sort of like seeing what everyone else is talking about and behaving, and stuff like that.
So you were the executive. You were the executive, and then you had management, and then obviously the people in that operational sort of layer.
Yeah, and that's where having an additional set of eyes, which is a little bit removed from the day to day, is good to have someone identify that, okay, this thing is happening, right? Oftentimes, when it comes to the conflict like this, sometimes it's too late. Sometimes conflict has happened, and you should have addressed this even beforehand, right? So what I've sort of seen is that the conflict is not the conflict. It's a symptom of organizational dysfunction. It's a symptom of not people just working in silos sometimes and not talking with each other. A lot of times managers are just saying, hey, you talk with this person and just, having people talk to each other. A lot of times this happens. A lot of times conflict does happen, and you have to do a little bit more of investigation work of, is it just this time, or has it happened, a few more times? And, how did those things evolve? And, or are people carrying their biases for this upcoming, conflict as well? What's going on? So I've had situations like this as well. So yeah, I mean, it really depends upon the situation to the situation, but this is where culture comes in, and having a healthy culture of there's a way of disagreeing, right? In every healthy team, you will have disagreements. It's just how do you go about, with a plan and sort of like coming up with a shared way, an aligned way of going about things despite the disagreements. Sometimes you would want to disagree and commit, right? Sometimes you would want to find a completely different way that neither side had thought of before, right? So, yeah, when it comes to different points of view, how do you resolve those things is something that a good team culture sort of like has that. Whereas people who are part of bad teams, generally when they come towards a different point of view, they push back. And that's the only thing that they're interested in having the last word or proving themselves right, rather than, how do we achieve the best result, right? They're not thinking about the team. They're thinking about how do I get this person, or how do I prove myself right? So taking the interest of the larger team or the larger company is something that, that healthy teams do.
So sort of three situations come to mind, and this is, and of course, there's many variations and sort of nuances of this. But one is that you sort of have a very small company, small team, and the culture is pretty much top down because the founders, that casual culture, or, eating at, all the things that have a foosball table at the office to that fun culture is trickled down to all those early employees. So that small knit team has that same culture top down. And whereas you have like a really large organization and, the top down culture is different versus maybe the individual pods that might exist, and where you have sort of that us versus them, whereas this one pod, working on this one aspect of the business might be really fun. And you go talk to a different department, they're all these like very serious sort of people. And then I've also seen another variation where the top down is sort of omnipresent, and the culture is all percolating from bottom up. So that's just some immediate sort of things that I've observed personally as well, and been part of and seen and experienced and seen sort of how that works. But in your experience, in the sort of the scale of eyeo or some of those companies that you've worked for, what are some of the tactful or daily things that they were doing, like from stand-ups to how were you sort of building that culture and those habits and encouraging those conversations even before the conflict could ever, even before getting to that point of conflict?
Yeah. So, there's what I've seen was that different teams can have, different cultures, and in those different cultures can each be healthy, right? Just as, you can have different teams having really dysfunctional cultures, but in different unique ways, you can also have good, healthy cultures and all of them being unique as well. It really depends upon a lot of times the personalities of the people in the teams involved, the size of the teams and what they're aiming for and stuff like that. So that's one thing. The main thing is healthy communication and regular communication amongst people within the team. And when you're a global team where maybe there's some people might be in North America, there might be some people in Europe, there might be some people in Asia, it may not be as practical to have, one daily stand-up video call every day because it timing wise may not work for people, but you might still want to find maybe once a week or twice a week, some place where people might, at least for a short amount of time, come together and talk about things, right? On top of this, regular updates asynchronously and regular sharing of efforts asynchronously, whether it's working collaboratively on a Google Docs, or whether it's pair programming, or whether it's collaborative design in Figma or whatever. Doing things collaboratively instead of your own silo. That is something which regularly is good. There are always going to be disagreements. The main thing is how do you sort of talk through it, right? So doing a lot of, and it depends upon who is in the leadership of the team as well. Like as part of team leadership, if you take the effort to do a lot of planning and involve the team upfront, instead of saying, hey, this is what I've thought about, and now we're going to do this. That once again, people don't like surprises, right? And people want to understand what their role is. So as long as they're bought in what the effort of the team is, what are the strategy and everything else, how do they fit in, it's usually a good way to go. When it comes to engineers, for example, the way in which you give feedback also matters. Like, for example, snarky comments on people's code reviews and that can over time build up, so those are things you have to see that you're not building up resentment with people within your own team by giving feedback in the wrong way, right? So that is one of those things that you have to come up with, and sort of like engineering management needs to take a look, for example, and sort of like say, hey, if you want to give feedback at code reviews, for example, avoid these things, and look out for these things, stuff like that. Small things like these over time can matter. The way in which you're disagreeing, the way in which you're giving feedback, the way in which you're accepting feedback, all those things matter quite a lot when it comes to team health.
Right. And so sort of, is there like a specific example of how not to do it and how to do it in terms of giving reviews to an engineer? And then after that, I want to I want to get your point of view on, because you are now hiring sort of diverse teams, and they could be based anywhere in the world, and they're coming with their own sort of cultural background. And, culturally, as you and I are aware that, Europeans are very different from Indians, and North Americans are very different from Europeans and Indians. So there's like that aspect of it. And then how do you sort of bring that knowledge and factor in those things? Or how does that sort of play into not only giving feedback to maybe, let's say, something very tactful, like specific to an engineer, but like how does that sort of percolate across, this very diverse group of people?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do a lot of times with making people aware of people's, general communication patterns and styles. I've had people who joined, from one part of the world, and when they were talking with people from another part of the world, usually German or Dutch, who are a little bit more frank, a little bit more to the point, and the way in which they were giving feedback to them was pretty standard, but to others, it caught them by surprise that, what the hell, they thought it was a very undiplomatic way of saying things, but, so those are things where both people are, just right in terms of, they weren't doing anything which was uncalled for. They were just stating, what was wrong or what needs to be improved. But sometimes you need extra padding, or sometimes you need to recognize that, in some other cultures, the way in which people are giving feedback is a little bit more direct. So don't take it personally, and at the same time, you have to, sort of like say that to the other person as well, that, yeah, other cultures, you need to pad the way in which you're giving feedback a little bit, not too much. Don't bullshit people, but just to make it a little bit more diplomatic. That will over time make you a much better colleague. If you recognize, the difference in communication patterns in different cultures. If you're working as part of a global team, this is to be expected, right?
Right. That actually makes a lot of sense, that you're sort of working both the angles. You're helping them learn more about the other side and vice versa. So that's and then is there any unique way or in your personal experience in giving critical feedback? Because I remember you talking about sometimes giving critical feedback is not the easiest, that you've had to give very critical feedback and how you sort of dealt with it. And
one of the things that I, when I was talking to a few other people regarding feedback, one of them was, a psychologist and sort of like a coach as well. And they said something very interesting, which was, people cannot change their personality. They can change their behaviors, but people cannot change their personality. So avoid giving feedback on people's personality. You can give feedback on people's behavior, how they behaved in a situation. But you should not give feedback on, for example, you're a neurotic person, or you're generally like this. That's not helpful, and sometimes might be even hurtful. Right? But you can definitely say that in this situation, for example, this was these things that I observed. This is what it could cause as an effect for other people. And as a suggestion, I would suggest you do this the next time you encounter this situation. So I've had situations in the past where I did have to give critical feedback, but I made it about the behavior, not the personality. And that is something that I think, more people should do. And to make that distinction, whether this is something that they're giving feedback on, whether that's the behavior or whether that's the general personality of the person. And I agree with that as well. You cannot really change inherently who you are in terms of like your personality, but you can definitely, adjust the way in which you react or behave in certain situations, or at least be cognizant of the fact that if you're saying something in a certain situation, this could cause other people to think so and so, right? So, for example, there was this one time, actually more than one time, for different people, where they mentioned something like they wanted to refer to people like engineers on their team, and they said my engineers are going to do this, or my developers are going to do this. So I had to give them feedback saying, yeah, this might result in the engineers on your team, getting the wrong idea. I know what you're trying to say, but you can say it in another way, which is the engineers on my team, right? So that is.
So by the way, tell us a little bit more about, so how did you help that person sort of rephrase that statement to what did that new statement become then for that person?
It was just, they just adjusted very quickly. And they when I said that, their light bulb sort of like clicked, and then they're like, oh yeah, of course. And they were, very, very, they didn't question it or anything. They got it, right? And they very quickly just, in the end, from that point onwards, they just mentioned, oh, the engineers on my team are going to do this. So it's a collaborative effort. They're not anyone's developers. They're developers on the team. You're also on the team. So, and they were very quick. They were very bright. So no complaints there. But these are sometimes blind spots that needs to be sort of like highlighted, because, well, it's your blind spot. You don't really recognize it, but once you get that feedback, you can adjust. You can quickly change.
That's fantastic, man. It's like all these little subtle things that you're tweaking, refining, that not only help look at the overall, like the shared vision and values piece of like, how does this all sort of ladder up, but how are we sort of communicating that, which percolates into, or which, connects into or bleeds into the culture, how people feel about the work that they're doing, how that ladders up to the big picture. And then also, how that looks from a team perspective, and how those teams feel connected to other teams, almost like like an organic, in a more organic way versus a more like, these are the different verticals. We have our own P&L. And, it's building those bridges and connections. Now, sorry, I wanted to switch gears for a second. You talk about this thing called isomorphic mimicry. What is that? And by the way, for the audience listening, I am going to put the links to this blog article as well in the show notes. But do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this is sort of almost the opposite of NIH Syndrome. NIH Syndrome is like, or institutional exceptionalism, you could say, is that, this is not going to work for anything. Even if it's a really, really good thing, it's not going to work for us because we're different, stuff like that. Isomorphic mimicry is just taking whatever best practice that works for others and trying to implement it in your org or your team, without regard for whether it's going to actually work for you. It may not, right? A good example of this is, a lot of times people take a look at big companies like Google or Microsoft and some of the tools that they're using and sort of like use that in their own teams, which a lot of times makes sense, but a lot of times they're small startups, and the problems that Google is solving is Google scale problems. And the problems that your team might be solving might be very small or different problems, right? And the tools or the techniques or approaches that they're using may not be the best that you might be using. So isomorphic mimicry is sort of like a biological, like a term in biology that was used to refer to some animals, sort of like mimicking, some other more dangerous animals, so that predators might think that the more dangerous animal rather than them. So sort of like just mimicking what the other, animal is doing, right? And sometimes it actually works. Sometimes, you take best practices without thinking much, and, you have good results. But it's always good to take a look at what's best practice and then synthesize this with the needs and the capabilities of your own team, and sort of like, if it needs a little bit of adjustment, you do that and then implement it. So that is sort of like what we should probably aim for.
What meme comes to mind is like a little poodle wearing, the lion's mane.
Yeah.
You're not the lion, but it's cute.
Exactly.
But yeah, I think it's important to have context that, what works in another situation might not work in yours because of multitude of reasons, from cultural differences to the financial implications of that to, compliance issues, based on your region. It could be multitudes of reasons. So it's important to look at context and know if it's actually even relevant to your specific situation. Maybe it works really well in one team, but doesn't work across the org. And so how does that sort of lead to the ladder up to the Voyage piece? Fantastic. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground in terms of, one is sort of, we, started off this conversation in terms of, did a little bit of a double click and dive into sort of your experience with Opera and that browser space, which then sort of evolved into, privacy and blocking ads? And then how does blocking ads look like from the entire ecosystem of the web, creating that tiered system and giving access to all kinds of people on the internet, people who might not have credit cards, or that Professor Scott Galloway quote that, the rich people don't have to see ads, but we're trying to create a more equitable sort of experience, bring in more diversity. And then we got more into, when you got into this Adblock Plus team, how you what your thought process in terms of that ecosystem, having that holistic vision, that Voyage piece that you talked about from that. And by the way, we'll link all those blogs that you've written in the show notes below. And then how you take that big thinking and look at it from a business case, and then take that to leadership. And then from that leadership, how do you start translating that into, okay, what kind of resources do I need? What kind of team do I need to build? Do I inherit a team? Do I hire a team? What does the composition of a team look like? What are some of the cultural attitudes, us versus them? And then how do those teams talk to each other? And then how does that ladder up to the bigger goal? And then one thing that we just want to pull out of that part of the conversation was knowing how your company makes money. Mm-hmm. Also sort of connected to how your client makes money is really helpful, because it'll help you when you get looking for a promotion, or, when you want to have a high resolution conversation with a client. And then we also talked about, giving critical feedback and how to be sensitive to that, and also being preemptive about things that might happen in the future. And I think you want to sort of take care of those early on by having more conversations, learning about different team members, and then you also talked a little bit about, and you touched on the NIH Syndrome, which is not invented here. And you also talked about the institutional exceptionalism and then the isomorphic mimicry. Now, we've covered a lot of ground. And out of all of sort of this conversation arc, are there things that you feel are missing that we should cover in terms of the team aspect, or any other pieces that you want to sort of add to any gaps? By the way, firstly, hold on a second. Is that a fair summary of what we've talked about?
Yeah, it was a really, really good summary. Like, I think I would have missed a few myself. But it's good. Were you taking notes in between?
Nope. It's all up here.
Wow. Nice.
I was just listening because I really enjoyed what you were saying. So I was paying attention. One thing I did miss now that is the Voyage, the journey that, what was his name again? Shackleton took, and how that sort of relates to leadership. Before we jump into that final segment, any final thoughts and notes on everything that we've touched on so far?
I think you've done a really, really good job of sort of, summarizing everything. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Dude, I loved it. I'm like, every time I talk to someone, I feel like I'm learning so much. And just by documenting these conversations, it's like no work, because I would just want to have this conversation with you anyways. I'd be like, oh, so how does that happen? So how did you tackle that? And then what did happen there? So I'm just generally a very curious person. So
that's always a good thing to have.
And, I'm always like trying to learn new things, new ways of doing things. And I mean, of course, there's a lot of people who are curious and learners, but that's just really at the core of who I am as a person. But okay, so coming back to sort of our conversation, I don't want to go off on a tangent there.
Just one tangent, which was like, I wish I could have sort of brushed up back on the Shackleton story, because that's a really, really interesting story. Like, there's a lot of detail that I'm missing right now, because I haven't really gone back and sort of like reread my own blog post. But there's a book called Endurance, which was the name of the ship, which got sunk. And by the way, just this year, it sunk in the Antarctic, and it wasn't found for like 100 years. Just this year, they found it again, 10,000 feet below the sea. So yeah, that was pretty big news as well. So
dude, that is so cool. Okay, so I'm gonna get that book. and I'll link the book also in the show notes. And then to the article on where I'll also sort of do a post, this recording, I'll look up where they found the ship, and I'll link that also in the show notes as well. So for people who are curious about, the Endurance ship, I'm so curious about this now. And okay, so the final leg of our conversation. So out of all these experiences that you've had, and, especially when it comes to as a hiring manager, what are the qualities, especially for, if you're hiring a remote first sort of organization, if that was a correct assessment of the company that you were working for. But by the way, hold on, before you even get to summary, is there anything that you want to talk about in terms of your stealth startup? Can you talk about your stealth startup at all? Anything at all, or it's under wraps?
It's under wraps, but it is going to tackle many of the things that we're talking about right now in terms of. So it is going to be about, about helping people in their careers and making sure that they can get their next promotion, or, they can generally level up in their skills. So it's going to be in that area.
I don't know what you're building. I'm so curious what this, but this is great. I love it that you're, I think it's so satisfying being able to translate what you've learned and pass on that knowledge. I think that's inherent to human existence. So that's fantastic. So now coming back to the final segment of our conversation is, if you were to put on the lens of a hiring manager and you're looking at this prospective sort of employee, how should that employee show up versus what they're currently doing? Like maybe 3 things that you see them doing wrong and versus what they should be doing is where we could maybe end this conversation.
Okay. So the first thing, it starts with the CV or the resume. And there are 2 things over there. One, a lot of these resumes are too long. I've seen people with, 2 or 3 years of experience having 2 or 3 pages in the resume. And I'm like, this is just, unless you're more than 10 years, or you should not have that. Try to make it as succinct as possible. Preferably a 1-pager. That would be what I would recommend. So that immediately is something which turns a lot of people off. Oh, by the way, these are guidelines. These are not like set rules. You might have genuine reasons to put like a lot of stuff in there. But more or less that is one thing that I've seen a lot of times, people just putting in a bunch of different things. Especially when it comes to people in India, they keep putting things which are no longer relevant. Like as a product manager, I don't really care what your board exam percentage was. I really don't. I don't care what your hobbies were in high school, and it's just one of those things. Also, and this is a subjective thing, but for me, I don't really look at what, in your CV, people put objective, to do blah, blah, blah. Everyone just puts in the most generic stuff over there. It doesn't provide any value to me to know what your quote unquote objective is, especially since, you've seen this as well, where you can never really plan this. Like people's career can go and take, different shapes, and you can never predict that. So, I don't really look at the objective part, or at least don't take it as seriously. So if you're spending a lot of time agonizing over what would be the perfect stuff to put as part of your objective, at least for me, I don't really I take a look at what have you achieved in your previous jobs. In what way were you effective? What value did you bring to the business? All those kind of things. And then the second part with the CV or the resume is, a lot of times, especially for product management roles, you would want to talk about not just your roles and responsibilities. I mean, that is not what I'm looking for as a hiring manager. What I'm looking for is what impact did you make? Did you move any metrics? Did you achieve any, big wins for the business? Those are like, talk about the outcomes and talk about the impact that it had, rather than the day-to-day stuff, which is part of the role. I mean, that is not something which is particularly exciting, doesn't give me any kind of insight into how effective you were. And those are things that sometimes I do see in the resume, like, things like, for example, taking part of in team stand-ups, or, writing, user tickets and stuff. It's like, yeah, of course you would do that, but, it's what value did you bring? What impact did you have? What metrics did you move? Those are things, if you can quantify them, even better. That are things that give an idea of, what it would have, or what would mean to have you as part of the team.
Fantastic. So the two things, if I was to summarize, one is be succinct with your resume, contextualize, sort of what you're applying for, but more from the lens of the company that you're applying for. How does your experience relate to that? And then bring in the outcomes of what you've done, not of what you did, what you were doing day to day, but how that impacted KPIs, results, business outcomes, and what kind of impact you had, right? Versus what you were doing.
One more thing I just remembered was, a lot of times, many of these resumes will have acronyms that you don't know what they are. These are probably like usually internal project names and stuff. So like sometimes you might use acronyms for industry standard terms like OKRs, or even KPI is an acronym, right? That's fine. But if you're using like, okay, I increase revenue in this whatever acronym project, like, I don't know what that project is. It's an internal tool that you've made somehow. Like, I don't know what that is. So, at least you can have a one line and explaining what exactly was that, right? So a lot of times you might have some stuff which is difficult to understand because it's just an acronym that no one else apart from your own company knows. So just keeping that in mind is also good.
I think there's a distinction here, actually. Now that I've as I'm thinking of how I'm going to summarize this, but I think what we should do is, now, of course, there's a lot of the experience levels of people that are going to be applying to companies. Now, there's a beginner and there's somebody who's sort of mid-career and somebody who's very experienced. I think we should make a distinction for people who are just starting out, coming out of school, and they did some project as an internship with school, versus somebody who's more experienced. So, because somebody who's just coming out of school might not necessarily know, how that impacted business outcomes and impact that they made, versus somebody who's a little more experienced. So I think even though somebody might be just coming out of school, they can still talk about impact. They can still talk about the outcomes that happened, based on what they explored, or a prototype that they might have made, or whatever that thing is, versus somebody who is a little bit more well versed with corporate lingo and executive speak, sort of that sentiment. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, just sort of draw that distinction. And for people listening to this, if they're especially beginner versus somebody who's senior, how that might be sort of.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to freshers, a lot of times all you have are your marks or some projects that you've done or things of that nature, right? So it's completely okay and valid to rely upon those. Having said that, usually speaking, hiring managers would want to take a look at things which are beyond your academics as well, something to show that you have demonstrated initiative beyond the books, right? So whether it could be some kind of like part-time internship where you've made some kind of impact, or you've done you're part of some other community or group and you made some kind of impact over there, or you've done something on your own, made your own product or things of that nature, your own website.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I know that, when you got noticed and got your first job, as a fresher, because it just showed a bent of mind, a curiosity, initiative, all those things. So what is that one thing what's that thing that you did? And just as a sort of a throwback to our previous conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I actually don't remember my resume. I remember more the list of questions that Oprah had at that time. My resume did indeed have, a mention of incredicampus.com, the site that I had made at that time. And I knew that some people from the Opera India team had visited and sort of, even sent feedback over there, which was quite encouraging. But overall, what I did in my resume, I remember at that time was still demonstrate the fact that I was learning stuff which was beyond the course curriculum, and I was actually implementing via the site or via participation in the community. My initiative, my proactiveness. I wasn't just relying upon marks in college, for example. Because in the end, people are not hiring you to pass an exam, right? I mean, people are hiring you to get things done. So the incentive structure is different over there. So you're no longer going to be mugging up and giving an exam. You're going to be tasked with achieving things, and results. And so having any kind of indication of if you can do well in that regard, even in your CV somehow, those are things that can be good things for you when you're applying as a fresher to a startup or a different company. For more experienced people, you would want to make sure that if it's just, unnecessarily large, that demonstrates that they have a problem in terms of like making things concise, right? And really getting to the heart of problems, right? It could also be a sign of, them not really understanding, what makes a good resume. So if they would want to hire like themselves after a while, that's not a good sign. Overall, what you want is a demonstration of have they achieved results, and it's difficult to measure in the CV. So this is one step after the CV, but in the interview rounds, you would want to know how are they as people, how have they worked as part of teams, how do they disagree with people or agree with people, and stuff like that. That's for the further rounds. But from the resume level, you would want to make sure that they are concise and they know how to demonstrate their impact.
Right. Absolutely. I think I'm just going to add one little point here. And this is something that we've talked about previously as well, is especially as a senior person, especially if you're going for like an executive position, you have to know how to speak executive, and you have to be able to express very concisely your points. That term executive summary, where you're almost talking to the CEO, because typically, executives are hired by CEOs. Depending on, obviously the scale and size of the operation and stuff, but depending, it's like SVP, VP, AVP, like depending on how many layers there are and all that stuff. But the ability to communicate in a very concise way and not sort of going all over the place, because a lot of culturally, I've noticed, when I'm talking to like people in India or, who are trying to get jobs, they're like, oh, I can do everything. It's like, no, especially as an executive, because at that point, and also to your point, what we talked about earlier is depending on where you are as an organization, because if you're going 1 to 0, you want a generalist. So if you're bringing in somebody very senior to help you build that thing, you do want, okay, I understand marketing, sales, and all that stuff. But if it's a more mature organization, then they're probably looking at subject matter experts at that point. So you have to have an understanding of where is this company in their journey, and then having that context. Who am I speaking to? Is this somebody of German descent? They'll care more about fact-based, logical, versus if I'm talking to somebody from a different place who might be slightly more emotional, and maybe they have a blog, they write about some sensitive issues. So you have to really know your audience, especially as an executive, because I think to your point, you're not just looking at skills, you're also looking at their temperament, their attitude, how they deal with conflict, because that's primarily what the job is, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hopefully
and also,
hopefully I'm still on pulse here.
No. And also there's a thing of, as you also mentioned, like at that stage, you're thinking about specialists or, people who, so for example, if you're hiring for, a VP of engineering, right? And they should have the opinion that, okay, I'm the VP of engineering. I'm not the best person to do product, for example, right? And vice versa, right? Sometimes there are people who are sort of like really generalists and they go higher up, and they can genuinely do both things. And there are roles like, for example, CPTOs or CTPOs, however you say, which are out there, right? But usually, by the time you're hiring VPs, you're at a stage where you're no longer a small startup, right? And you need more and more specialists to come up. At the same time, as the organization grows, even within that specialization, there's many different aspects of it. So even in engineering, you might have people working on the server side, you might have front-end people, you might have AI people. So being more of a generalist, trying to understand, but within that domain is going to be important. So you don't want a VP of engineering who only cares about front-end and doesn't, care about cloud or things like that, for example. So it's interesting. You need to have more specialization, but at the same time, have people more generalists within that domain.
Got it. Right. So you are generalist, but within the context of that specific vertical. That actually makes a lot more sense, because now you know how all those different parts sort of come together and how they sort of speak to each other, because ultimately, under the hood, there's software, hardware, depending on sort of what kind of company you're in, and you sort of have to understand the length and breadth of it. Okay, cool. Any other final thoughts before we wrap up for today?
Yeah, just the role of communication in general is and sensing, what the other person is thinking, the role of empathy is really important. And yeah, that's something which I always keep talking about all the time. I think I even talked about it last time we talked. So I think that is something that we need to keep on talking about, because it's really important.
Absolutely. Totally agree. I think irrespective of technologies, the different rails that might come and go, different technologies, that might come and go, the world's going to change, but ultimately it's people communicating with other people to get things done, to make things happen. So communication is always going to be sort of that central fugal force underneath everything. So this was a great conversation. I learned a lot, and I will be putting all the show notes. In the show notes, I'll be putting all the links to all the blog articles and the story of endurance. And that I'll also get that book and that link also in the show notes. This was a great conversation. I had a lot of fun. Thank you, Shwetank.
Same here. Thanks.